And we're going to go straight to our first speaker, Russell Pittman from the Antitrust Division of the US Department of Justice. He's going to talk to us about vertical mergers.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. I start with the usual disclaimer. The views expressed are those of myself and not necessarily those of the Department of Justice. And I also start, just to avoid misunderstandings, I'm going to talk about railways, but I'm going to talk about freight railways, not passenger railways. If you have some questions about passengers in the Q&A, I will try to answer them, but my presentation concerns freight railways. So, as some of you know, and maybe some of you don't, in the Western Hemisphere, US, Canada, Mexico, we have privately owned freight railways. So we have vertically integrated companies that own their track, run their own trains, generally do not have to let anybody else's trains run on their tracks. It historically was a fragmented industry, but has become more concentrated over the years. I think most people think now too concentrated as a result of many, many mergers. The mergers that we have seen may be parallel or they may be end-to-end. So in this schematic, we basically have two big Western railways, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe and the UP. We have two big Eastern railways, the CSX and the Norfolk Southern, and they go from Long Beach, they intersect in Chicago and St. Louis and Kansas City and a few other places, and go all the way to the East Coast to New York, for example. So in this example, a horizontal merger, also called a parallel merger, speaking non-mathematically, would be if the two Western railroads merged and they reduced the number of options for freight shippers from, say, Los Angeles, Long Beach to Chicago from 2 to 1. An end-to-end rail merger, and these are under discussion now, would be, for example, if the Burlington Northern Santa Fe merged with the CSX. So you could have actually a transcontinental railway, freight railway, all the way from LA Long Beach to New York, as is the case in Canada, by the way. Both of Canada's major freight railways, the Canadian Pacific and the Canadian National, are transcontinental. They go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. There is an interesting aspect of the end-to-end mergers, which is relevant to the discussion of vertical mergers here, which is this, I think people have found the pointer doesn't work, is that right? Well, if I am shipping a container from Los Angeles to New York, I can't ship it all the way on my railroad, Western Railroad. I have to intersect in Chicago or St. Louis or Kansas City and get somebody else to take it to New York. So in that sense, the Western railways and the Eastern railways are complements. On the other hand, if I'm in Chicago and I want to send steel somewhere, the Western railroads and the Eastern railroads can actually compete for my business. The Western railroads want to take it to Salt Lake City or Eugene, Oregon. The Eastern railroads want to take it to Atlanta or Washington, D.C. That's what we call source competition or freight competition. So a freight rail merger that looks vertical and complementary may also have some horizontal and substitution effects as well. Now, I'm going to talk about vertical rail mergers, end-to-end rail mergers of these vertically integrated companies. And in general, I'm going to focus on the fact that the regulator, the U.S. rail regulator, which is now the Surface Transportation Board, has emphasized a condition for 100 years or more on such a merger. They have emphasized what they call open gateways. And what that means is if Burlington Northern merged with the CSX and they interchanged at Chicago, for example, the idea is that the merged railway would still allow the other railways to interline with it. So the idea is that the UP would still join CSX in a joint line move to New York, even though its competitor, the Burlington Northern, could do the same. So this is the open gateways, essentially a non-discrimination requirement, and I'm going to focus on that just a bit. So where this idea started with what I'm working on is the last big U.S.-Canadian rail merger, and it will probably, the last one we've seen, as I said, there's some discussion now of transcontinental rail mergers, but for now, I think the regulator has made pretty clear that's going to be a very high hurdle. This most recent merger saw the Canadian Pacific, after a takeover battle, merging with the Kansas City Southern. And you can't see them on the map, but in the west of the United States, there are only two big railways, the ones on my schematic, the Burlington Northern and the UP. In the east of the United States, there are only two big freight railways, the CSX and the Norfolk Southern. Kansas City Southern has always gone north-south, basically bisecting the country. As of about 10 years ago, it moved from Texas into Mexico, and it controls one of the now two large privately owned or privately franchised freight railways in Mexico. Canadian Pacific, in red on this map, is mostly a Canadian railway, but it goes south into the US to Kansas City. And so when these two wanted to merge, they actually literally was only one point of intersection, Kansas City. And if you can see it here, it's right in the middle of the country where the red line runs into the black line. The Canadian Pacific running into the Kansas City Southern, or I think it's now called, well, it's got a new name anyway. And the STB, the regulator, said, well, this is a classic end-to-end merger. There's no parallel competition between these two. They could have and probably did look at the question of whether there was source competition at Kansas City, because a shipper in Kansas City might be approached by both railways to ship its grain, for example, north or south. But Kansas City is one of three major U.S. rail hubs that has, give or take, three railroads going north, three railroads going south, and they decided there just wasn't going to be the likelihood of any kind of source competition issue. But they did say, and by the way, like with every other end-to-end rail merger, you have to have open gateways. So again, the idea was the regulator insisted that just because Canadian Pacific ran to Kansas City and then KCS ran south of Kansas City, the merged railway would still take interchanging traffic, either coming up from the south or coming from the east or the west, or coming down from the north. The merged railway would still accept interline traffic by the other non-affiliated railways. That's what they meant by open gateways, as they have for 100 years. Now, I want to talk in general. I'm not going to talk too much generally, but in general, some people would argue, and did argue for quite a long time, that vertical mergers should be considered presumptively beneficial. There is, right, Marty, that was wrong. That's what we understand. that you know, they would be efficient. They would eliminate the the dreaded double marginalization, which economists love to talk about and explain to people who don't understand it, and that they should be generally encouraged. However, we have discovered over the years vertical mergers do raise some competitive concerns, especially regarding discrimination against unintegrated either upstream or downstream rivals. And so in the railway sector, there has been this concern about connecting railways, again, either going toward a destination or coming from an origin, that in the past connected with one of those two railways, like the Canadian Pacific or the KCS, and now the merged railway wouldn't have any interest in connecting with them, and in some way would make those connections harder. So, vertical mergers raise many issues in a variety of sectors. I'm only talking about rail, but you may ask yourselves how well these lessons apply to other sectors. If the concern is discrimination against unintegrated rivals, one remedy, behavioral remedy, has been non-discrimination requirements, and that's essentially what the open gateways requirement is. As I've studied this question, I've learned a lot from some papers that I can recommend to you. One of them is by my friend Siyu Zhou in Shanghai, a conference paper, a couple of law review articles by Herbert Hovenkamp and Joshua Shapiro. But in general, the real well-known issue in terms of non-discrimination is dealings between two firms are very complex. And the regulator can try its best to look for all the signs, whatever the interchange fee is or whatever, scheduling, all these things get very complex, and it's hard for regulators to prevent discrimination. And I think rail regulators around the world have found that out, and it's another topic, but that's one reason why there's been concerns about vertically integrated railways being forced to open up access to other train companies. There's been concerns that they would always discriminate. I think a lesser discussed issue, but seems to me maybe just as important, is that for an integrated firm, the internal transfer price is endogenous. It's not like you're promising to always to follow some exogenous rule, I don't know, the interest rate, whatever it is. If I'm a vertically integrated firm, good luck proving that my transfer price is wrong. So I can raise my transfer price, and no, I'm not going to discriminate. You're going to pay the same thing I am. Good luck to the regulator or the court to show that my transfer price is illegal. So again, for the U.S. vertically integrated vertical mergers in railways, the common remedy has been a regulatory requirement to maintain open gateways. Now, even early on, 100 years ago, there was pushback on saying, wait a minute, if you really require these guys to keep behaving as they were with the independent railways, what happens to the efficiencies of the end-to-end merger, which most people accept in railways? A single line railway is generally lower cost. You don't have to interchange. What happens to the efficiencies if you prohibit the vertically integrated railway from taking more traffic? So there's been pushback along these lines for years. And then the waters started becoming muddy when the ICC said, the ICC is the predecessor to the STB, the ICC said, well, there are open gateways as long as there's not a diversion of an undue amount of traffic. Or the gateways are open if traffic that is economically efficient still goes on those routes. Or on commercially reasonable terms. Well, it's been pretty clear, and indeed the railways involved have said, you know, again, how can you prove that these terms are commercially reasonable or not? So those kinds of terms were not considered to be very effective. The ICC started backing away from a requirement for anything really imposing regulatory open gateways, forcing the integrated railway to take traffic that it didn't want. And yet, it's still, the STB is still imposing open gateway requirements. So what to do? What are the alternatives to protect the railways for losing traffic? Well, one of them, which didn't last very long, was indemnities. So the merged railway would have to pay the independent railways for traffic that it lost, based on how much traffic it took from them. It was pretty clear that this was a very regulatory solution and gave terrible incentives to the merged railway and even to the independent railways. So they could say, oh, I lost all this traffic. You've got to give me $1 million. So that didn't last very long. The ICC backed away from it, and a pretty well-known economist, Darius Gaskins, PhD economist, was the chair of the ICC at the time. He later became the chair of the Burlington Northern Railway. He's quite an interesting guy. The way the situation finally resolved itself, first of all, one of the large shippers organizations, the National Industrial Transportation League, proposed that the STB impose a cost increase ceiling on post-merger rates for a certain number of years. So there is a rail cost adjustment index, and if the merged railway wanted to raise its rates, obviously we hope it'll lower its rates, it's more efficient. But if it wants to behave anti-competitively and raise its rates, it can only do so up to the point of the rail cost adjustment factor. And if it tries to do more, it has to justify itself, either to the shippers or the regulator. And there's a nice little article in a completely obscure journal, very theoretical article, saying basically if two end-to-end railways merge, if you put a cap on the price increase, you know, we economists all hate price caps, we all hate price controls, but if you put a cap on the price increase, there's not going to be any loss of welfare. And that is, in fact, what the STB has ended up doing. It has, get the right page here, in the Canadian Pacific KCS merger, it imposed a 7-year requirement that the merged railway would have to file a written justification for any rate increase over the cost increase index. And, you know, so this essentially protects everybody from any harm from an end-to-end merger. As I say on here, and again, is another topic, the number of large freight railways in North America and or the US are getting small enough that there are reasons to worry about other concerns. For example, the railways have competed in some ways technologically. For example, they have all allegedly agreed to, on some terms of a fuel price index increase. And of course, railways traditionally have competed to get firms to build new factories on their lines rather than somebody else's. So other than those, it seems to me, as an economist who hates price ceilings, that the STB has figured out the best way to protect shippers. And Sean yesterday quoted Winston Churchill talking about crises going to opportunities. I'm going to paraphrase him and say that you can always count on American regulators to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got time for a couple of questions. Amelia?
Just the most obvious of questions, really, which is, why do you think, I mean, I can see why you think the remedy is finally a good one, but why do you think 7 years is enough? And if it isn't enough, is it a good one?
I'm sorry, I've been complaining about the acoustics for 2 days. Can you repeat a little more slowly?
So it's a price cap for 7 years. I can see that a price cap for longer than that's really hard to design because all sorts of things can change. However, that is only a price cap for 7 years. Do you think that somehow there's going to be magic changes in the market that you don't need a price cap in 7 years? Or do you worry that in 7 years you still have an anti-competitive merger?
Well, it's certainly a possibility that 7 years is not long enough. In fact, we have the tradition in the U.S. of imposing conditions on mergers, rail and otherwise, way longer than that, sometimes even in perpetuity. And I think there's a general agreement that things change a lot over a lot of years. And, you know, the freight railways in the U.S., unless something big changes, are still going to have some regulation in 7 years. It is a deregulated sector, but there are regulations still. And you know, I think if at the end of 7 years, if there are problems, the STB will be able to step back in. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions from the audience, oh, there's one in the front here. You just wait for the mic to get to you so people online can.
I was wondering, you said that when you ship stuff from west to east, you have to stop in Chicago and then change for another company. Why can't you have regulation that allows trains from the west to continue all the way to the east using the tracks of the other company, like open access?
All right, if I understand your question, why don't we have transcontinental railways? Is that the question?
Exactly, and then you don't need to rely on mergers to fix some efficiencies because you can do it with open access.
Well, and people are proposing that now, and it's an interesting issue. I think the reason goes back to one of my last slides, which is the STB has said, excuse me, if we allow, given the way the U.S. rail map works, if we allow a transcontinental merger, there's going to be another one and maybe another one. And we're going to end up with maybe two Canadian transcontinental railways and 2 U.S. transcontinental railways. And that will be efficient for long-term shipments, but it will reduce to a very small number the number of independent railways with the costs that I was talking about elsewhere. I mean, one of the biggest examples, after a bad crash, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, the rail regulator imposed on the U.S. largest freight railways an obligation to install something called positive train control. Basically an autopilot if something happens to the driver. And it was very expensive. One firm had a big technological lead, and at least 2, and it was cooperating with one of the Class 1s, but at least 2 of the other Class 1s began cooperating with competitors to try to develop alternative positive train control systems, mainly, I think, so they wouldn't be at the mercy of the quote-unquote monopolist. So, as I said, we think there are efficiencies to end-to-end mergers, but we also think there are benefits of competition. And the regulator has even sort of hinted that they've already allowed too many mergers. So I personally would expect they will not allow this, even if they're proposed, but some of the railway executives have also said the regulator's never going to allow that, so why are we wasting our time? But, you know, it's a fair question. There would be some efficiencies, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And those of us who have read about the early history of the Sherman Act are very warmed by the fact that railways are still an issue when it comes to competition law.
Much more than 7 years later.
Thank you very much, Russell.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're now going to move on.
Thank you.
We're now going to move on to our second speaker, who is Subhasish Chowdhury, a former UEA colleague of ours, who is now at the University of Sheffield, and he's going to talk to us about profitability and collusion.
Thanks. It's good to be back. And yeah, this is going to be a bit different from all the merger talks we are talking about. This is going to be collusion. And this is a joint work with Freddie, who is sitting there, Julian from Reading, and Steve Davies. That was his the first and only experimental project. Sadly, he passed away a couple of years back. So, and as you can see, we're going to talk about profitability as well as collusion. I don't think I have to explain too much to this crowd that collusion is bad. So bad for consumers, bad for market efficiency, and so on. And there are a lot of examples, like for example, 16 big cartels made the loss of around 55 billion in OECD, and 15.5 billion welfare loss, and 7.6% of what is estimated for 97 to 11 European drug cartels. So those are some of the just examples. There are much more, and we know people from CMA here that they find like the ways to try to deter cartel is to find and impose many other different deterrence efforts and so on. However, after knowing all this, and with a lot of literature that people have gone through, still there are straightforward but unanswered questions in this literature. One of them is profitability. So let's go through like very, very simple question. Two markets, similar otherwise, one market is more profitable than the other. Which market do you think would be more prone to make cartel, explicit cartel? And also we are assuming that the same kind of antitrust deterrence mechanisms are in place. Now, if you think about the standard like theoretical models, the answer would be the same. There is no one would be better than the other. Problem is there are two opposite forces at work. Now, if one market is more profitable, that means it's more profitable to join hand, make a cartel, and then share the profit. At the same time, if you make a cartel, it is more profitable to deviate from the cartel, cheat on your cartel partners, and grab more profit. So, if this market is more profitable, you have some incentive to join cartel. At the same time, if you join cartel, you have more incentive to cheat on your cartel partners. So, which one will work more? So, this is not actually very obvious which force is going to be more powerful. And this is a very, like, I think relevant question for the design authorities as well as private litigants and so on. And it's not easy to answer theoretically, also not easy to answer empirically, because we don't know how many cartels are there. If we knew, there would be no cartel. As a result, we don't know if one market with higher profit versus another market lower profit are similar. We don't know what their costs are, and so on and so forth. So one way it can be done is to run laboratory experiment where we can control everything. We can let people play the role of firms and see how they are behaving and set the parameters in a way such that we can answer these questions. And that's exactly what we do in this project. So we look at three things. A lot of things can be looked at, but we look at three things. First, we look at intent. Given there are differences in these two markets, which market has more attempt to make cartel? Second, outcome. How many cartels are actually forming? And what are the prices they are charging, if they're forming or not, in two different markets? And third, which is also quite interesting, especially if you are authority, that how often firms are deviating when they are making cartel, how stable the cartels are in these two markets. So as I mentioned that there is not much things are done in this area. There are theories on if a market is expanding or shrinking, then how people behave in collusive behavior, those things are done, but not separately this. And there also are theory as well as experiment on this growing and shrinking markets. There also are effect on how collusion affect your profit, and then that profit can affect your future collusion and so on. People have done those. And then of course there are price competition experiments, there are quite a few. And then what we are going to use in this particular case, we are going to use a simple market, 3 firms, barter game in which they are charging price. The lowest price is going to capture the market. And there are a lot of papers there. I specifically mentioned the last 2 of ours because the one with Freddie who is sitting there, Juan Schneider, there we try to find out how charging fine or increasing investigation, how that affects cartel behavior. And the next one is Carsten Krede, who is in the German Competition Authority right now. So there we found that if firms make cartel and the cartel gets busted or they broke up, still if they were stable before, they are able to keep higher price in a kind of, even after cartel breaks down, they keep tacit collusion and higher price. And we'll see that this would be relevant here as well. Okay. So in case I run out of time before Andreas stops me, so this is what we do. We run the very first experiment in the 3-firm barter market in which we have profitability or collusion. And what we find, both this intent to collude, how they are trying to make collusion, and how many cartels are getting formed are higher in the lower profit market. Okay, the profit has lower profit, they have higher of those 2. However, when you scale the prices, those are not very different from each other in the 2 markets. What you see is the price charged by non-cartel firms. They were doing cartel before, but now after some time they are not doing cartel. However, they are charging higher price. Okay, so probably there is still tacit collusion going on. And high profit market firms, these, once we know these things, why are we seeing this kind of difference between high and low profit? Well, because of this kind of intent to cheat from your cartel members, your partners. So high profit markets, we see that people deviating from cartel price more. That's essentially what we see in our paper. Okay. So this is the description of the experiment. So I hope you are familiar with the market experiments. What we do, we bring people in the laboratory, they play this market game in the computer, we collect data, and when they are playing this game, they are actually earning money. As if you are a firm, you are actually running transaction and you are earning your profit and so on. That's what we do there. And we have 4 cases, we call them 4 treatments. So in one case, we have low profitability, and that will end up being low willingness to pay. So how do we do really low profitability? We have a demand curve that is low, and then shift the demand curve up, that should be high. Okay, everything else for all the other firms are same. And then in one case, sorry, we don't allow the firms, because we can control everything, we don't allow the firms to communicate with each other. So that's as if there's no way to do explicit cartel at all. In another case, we allow them to communicate. So now we have 4 cases, low profit with no communication and with communication, NC, LC. Similarly, high with NC and high with C. And this is the way we run the experiment. So 3 firms, barter market, whoever charges the lowest price is going to get the whole market. Before charging the price, you can see the very first box, there they make the decision to collude. What is the decision to collude? They say that this is the highest price than anybody can charge in this market. Let's all of us charge the same highest price and divide the market with 3 of us. Okay, all of us are going to get the highest divided by 3. Then we learn whether everybody agreed to do the collusion or not. If everybody agreed, then we have a cartel. If the people did not agree, then we don't have a cartel. Okay? And then we charge price. Remember, although we agreed, collusion is not legal. So although we agreed, that doesn't mean I'll have to stick to the charging the highest price. It might be that we agreed to charge the highest price, and I think that you two are going to charge high price. I'm going to charge a little bit less. So you will not get anything in the market, but I'm going to get a huge profit. So that is possible. So you learn the price, whether everybody charge the same price or not and everything. And then, because we agreed to be in cartel, there's a chance that we'll get caught. If we get caught, we'll get a fine. So exogenously, there's a chance that we'll get caught, and then we'll learn whether we got caught, we got fined, and then we get our final payoff. And then we do the same thing again, just like happened in the market. It keeps on going. Okay. After 20 periods, there's an 80% chance the market will exist. Just kind of replicate the way infinite period goes with discount, and we run it like that. Okay. Before I go to specifics, I think we all talked about those. So this is where the communication works. Okay. So subjects, we call the people who are playing this in the experiment, we call them subjects. Subjects are asked whether they would like to collude to the highest possible price. They have to say yes or no. If all three say yes, it will be a cartel. If at least one of them say no, it will not be a cartel. And then when there is no communication, this part was not available at all. Okay. And what is the profitability? So it's a barter market with a robot buyer who has the willingness to pay 12 in the low market and 27 in the high market. Okay. So it's a between subject. So people who are playing this game in a low market, they never played the high market. So they don't know that this is a low profitability market and that was high. Okay. So essentially what happens, marginal cost is 0. So three of us are trying to charge price. Whoever charges lowest price is going to make a profit. Suppose two of you charge 12 and I charge 11. So my profit would be 11 minus 0, 11, and yours would be 0 because you could not sell, because you charge more, and so on and so forth. It will go on like that. Okay. And detection rate, following Bryant and Eckert, we make it 15%, and fine is 4 for low profit market and 9 for high profit market, essentially 1/3 of the highest profit that you can get. And the theoretical prediction is when you cannot communicate at all, then payoff dominant equilibrium would be charging 1. And there can be multiple equilibria, but if you think about trigger strategy, then you should collude and charge the higher price. That would be with communication. So this is the way we ran. These are the subjects who are playing this game. They cannot talk to each other, they cannot see anybody, and so on. Fixed matching means 3 people played for 20 plus periods with the same 3 people, they match with each other, just like what happens in a market. And we use this software and so on. Okay. So just the details. I think we already talked about this. So let's go to the outcomes. First, we are going to look at cartel activity, then outcome, then stability. First, we try to look at when you can talk to each other. How many times or what is the proportion of the firms they are trying to make cartel? You will see that if it's a low profit market, then firms are trying to make cartel more than high profit market. That's essentially what you see here. And they do it more in the very first few rounds in the short run. In the long run, they converge together. And when you run regression, that supports that people do it in the first few rounds compared to later. Now, this is how many firms are trying to attempt to cartel. You know, it might be 3 of us are in the market. I say, let's do cartel. You say, let's do cartel, but third person says no. Then cartel will not actually form. This shows how many times cartels are actually getting formed. That also, around 71.3% time, cartel getting formed is a low profit market. It goes down to 48.3 if it's a high profit market. So actual cartelization is also higher in low profit market. And so essentially, in low profit market, you have both high attempt as well as higher cartelization. Now, what is the performance then? We are going to look at 2 things, asking price and market price. What is asking price? Asking price is average of all the different prices a market is charging. Like there are 3 firms, they can charge 3 different prices. On an average, that we're going to call this asking price. And market price is the price that the product is getting sold for. That is the minimum of the 3, okay? Average and minimum. And you will see that asking price goes up for low profit market when you are you can communicate, which is understandable, right? People can talk to each other, they are charging higher price. Same for high profit market, but it's not significant enough. One thing that you can see that asking price is higher in low profit market than high profit market when they can talk to each other. Okay. And so on. And when you try to look at time trend, you can see clearly that in low profit market, asking price remains high all the time throughout. And then I think I'm just going to skip this one. Essentially what it says is asking price has a non-monotonic relationship about how many firms are trying to collude. If nobody is trying to collude, asking price is a bit high. And if all the firms are trying to collude, then asking price is high, in between is lower. Okay. And this is the interesting part. You can see that even when they are trying to charge prices, it can happen when you actually formed a cartel and when you did not form a cartel. You can see that for when you actually formed a cartel, there is no difference between high profit and low profit market. But if you did not form a cartel, then high profit, low profit market are charging higher asking price. Seems like they are going for tacit collusion. And for market price, you see exactly similar kind of result that you saw from asking price. And again, you see that there is no difference in the actual market price when you are looking for high and low. However, there is a difference, there is a difference in the low profit market, and that's significantly different from high profit market. So when you are not, you can talk to each other, you did collusion, but then you decided not to do collusion anymore, but you keep on charging high price. And you can sustain that kind of tacit collusion in a low profit market because you have less incentive to deviate. And the last part is stability. There are a lot of numbers. Let me just go and tell you that what are the kind of price that deviating firms are charging. What is deviating firm? Remember, I said we decided that we are going to charge the highest price, right? So if I am deviating, I am trying to cheat on my cartel partners and trying to grab the market, what kind of price we are charging? It turns out that when we are deviating, the prices are not very different from high or low profit market. However, in the first half of the experiment, I would say short run, at that time, if you look at the low profit market, they are charging higher compared to high profit market. So 3.77 versus 3.27. That doesn't happen in the very last part of the experiment. So let me just go to the result on the cartel stability. There is no overall difference in price deviation in the low versus high profit market. However, relatively inexperienced firms deviate from agreed price more and charge on average in the high profitability market. So essentially this explains why low profit market are more prone to cartel compared to high profit market, because firms in the high profit market, they get greedy when they are not experienced enough. They get greedy, they ask to join others to in the joint cartel, then they charge lower price and capture market, and that erodes trust between them, so they cannot keep on doing tacit collusion later. In low profit market, people don't have huge incentive to do so, and they keep on tacit collusion later. And you can see this, the first part is already what we already talked about, but these results are simply quite a lot of implication. So we have sample bias issue in the field data. When we get data from cartel, we get the data only the cartel that got busted. And they are different from cartel who are successfully still working. That is not the case here. We can observe everybody. This one is not, this experimental data doesn't have sample bias. So this data can allow us to focus more on how the policy would be in different kind of markets. And one thing we did not do, but this is very important in the market, is leniency. See, we just had fine, we didn't have leniency. That's something that can be done in this discussion. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Subho. Questions? Franco?
Yeah, thanks, Subho. So the one question I do have is in terms of, cartel, if you want, sustainability is it does make a difference if you know the probability of being caught if you're in a high profit market versus in a low profit market. Here, what you do know, if in the real world, you will be more likely to be caught, to be detected if you are in a high profit market than in a low profit market. So if I want to maintain stability of the cartel, I'm going to show that the market is a low profit market. So the cartel agreement would be such that the two markets should have the same profit if the probability of detection would be correlated with the differentiation in profits. In terms to maintain the stability of the cartel, I'm thinking this is not going to be picked here because the probability of being detected is the same. It's only the fines that are different in this kind of behavior. So, thanks.
So theoretically, what happens is because we kept it like a fixed, like willingness to pay and then zero marginal cost, then what matters when you are calculating is that willingness to pay minus zero and what fine you are charging. And fine is always 1/3 of that. That's why theoretically those two exactly are same. However, why are we seeing this? Because theory, and this is why also I mentioned about other paper with Freddie. What we know that people when they are making decision, they don't actually calculate everything. All this, what is percentage, what is the fraction? They don't think like that. People look at numbers. People look at numbers, and when they see some number is bigger than the other, they will not think about how to divide it and how to like go for next few periods and so on. They see this is bigger number, they get greedy and they try to deviate, and this is exactly what we see. So 9 is basically the number that you can get if you like agree with to do cartel in a high profit market. If you cheat on others, it should be 27 minus 9, say 18 or 17. So people see that if I cheat with my partners, I'm going to get 18 or 17. But in a small, like a low profit market, it's going to be 4 versus 12, so like 7 or 8. Proportionately, if you think about the two markets, 17, 18 or 7 or 8 should be same. But people don't look like that. They look at the number and they cheat more in the high profit market. And that's that behavioral bias what makes this difference. Otherwise, it should not be the case.
Hello. Good afternoon. I am Dipankar Das from Goa Institute of Management, India. It's very interesting paper. I have one just clarification I want to get from you that in that matrix, whenever you have presented that when no cartel situation is there, then average profit for low profit farms is higher than the high profit farms. And you have presented that, you have mentioned that is because of tacit collusion. It's fine. I agree with that. I just want to get one interesting notion from you that in a tacit collusion, some focal point or reference point actually is acting as a signal. Let's say we are not talking to each other, but we are getting some signal through some focal point. Okay, we are all meeting on that particular point and we'll be repeating that. So which value, it's an average value, more than average or less than average, is acting as a focal point in this case whenever they are forming a tacit collusion?
So what you see here, you see, we cannot mention whether 12, so in one market the highest price you can charge is 12, another market is 27. So you cannot have apple-to-apple comparison. The prices what you are seeing here are scaled. Okay, so scaled with like the full scale.
So variations.
Sorry.
Fluctuations, price fluctuations.
No. Scaled means suppose you charge 9.
Okay.
Okay, in a low profit market. Then in this kind of table, it will show 9 divided by 12, that is 0.75.
Okay.
And if you charge 9 in a 27 market, it will show 9 divided by 27, like 0.33. So to have 75%, you will have to charge much higher. So these are apple-to-apple comparison.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
So I might not completely understand kind of how the model works, but I think all your experiments are on repeated games?
Yes.
Okay, so then I'm concerned about the interpretation of these results, like on the right-hand side on the non-cartel. We know, I mean, all the experiments that I've run on collusion have always had a baseline in which you had kind of non-repeat in terms of others. So people played it every time with someone else. Mm-hmm. And your effect here, I would think from the low profitability to the high profitability, that you have a higher percentage there, comes from the fact that in Bertrand types of games, you basically never get someone play the Bertrand equilibrium. So in most of the experiments that we've run, basically the price is significantly above what the Bertrand equilibrium is in the one-shot equilibrium game. And then if you're comparing it, what you get in the repeated game without communication, it's also exactly the same. So I don't think there's any tacit collusion going on the right-hand side.
For this one,
Yeah.
this particular table, both are from communication treatment.
They're what?
Both are from communication treatment. So they can talk to each other in both. So
Yeah.
left side is they talked and formed a cartel, and here they talked but did not form a cartel.
Yeah, but the effect comes from the effect that you're going away from zero. So the percentages by which you're kind of getting to 100% of the lower value and the higher value is not interpretable as kind of more collusion or more exercise of market power.
So, so here, left side, when you look at cartel, that's more of explicit and implicit collusion mixed, I would say, but probably explicit collusion because they actually joined cartel. Here, it's a mix of price hysteresis as well as implicit collusion. Price hysteresis is essentially you charge some higher price and keep on charging it even if it's not correct for you in a repeated game. So this is a mix of price hysteresis and tacit collusion. A price hysteresis should not be different from low and high. So the difference that you see in the significance, that would be because of the behavioral bias. That's what we're saying. And yes, you also see normal, you also see this is price, market price, yes, this is market price. You also see for the NC treatments like LNC and HNC. Those are also significantly different from zero, which is significantly different from Bertrand. But if you think about what is the payoff dominant equilibrium, that would be like charging 1, that is 10%, right? So that's more or less like that.
Sorry to interrupt. This sounds like a great disagreement to have over a coffee after we've heard our last speaker. Thank you very much, Subho. Okay, so our final speaker is Sandra Colino, formerly of the University of Glasgow, now at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And she's going to be talking to us about horizontal mergers.
If I can put my slides on. Okay. Easier than I thought. Well, thank you so much for coming to the presentation. I'm delighted to be here. I just arrived this morning, so I'm slightly jet lagged. I apologize for that. But anyway, I'm going to try my best. So today I wanted to talk about the possibility of using structural remedies for horizontal mergers. And this stems from some research I conducted mainly last year, published in the Journal of European Competition Law and Practice. The paper is actually broader and looks just very generally at the ongoing reform of EU merger control. So today I'm going to pick on one specific proposal that we make in the paper. The paper was actually co-written by Mei-Si Chung, who is a practitioner, former student of mine, and now practicing at Gibson Dunn in Hong Kong. So just to explain to you that how this all came, how the research emerged. So we started by reflecting on the changes that have taken place in EU merger control. And you will see that we relate and we draw from the Chinese experience later on when it comes to the remedies. So as you know, there hasn't been a major regulatory reform, major change, but things have been the policy has been modified over the last few years. So the current rules date back to 2004. And this was the time, at the time, as you know, there was this shift towards the more economic approach due to a number of problems, mainly due to what some were describing as excessive agency discretion. The Commission had 3 resounding losses at the time, including, of course, the famous Air Tours case. And there was this concern that the decisions were hard to predict sometimes. So how did more economics translate in in the field of merger control. So overall, this meant that in practice, the Commission paid more attention to theories of harm, and there was more pressure on the Commission to prove the harmful effects of mergers if it wanted to either impose commitments or block a merger. So already, even if it's been a relatively short time in the grand scheme of things, there have been some issues with that system. I know that Professor Ibáñez-Colomo was saying that the more economics reform failed to win the hearts and minds of the Europeans. Some issues were that there's been some ideological shifts. As you know, the never-ending discussion about whether consumer welfare standard is the right approach, the right standard in EU competition law and policy. It's been interpreted in a specific way in the European context, including price, innovation, choice, and quality concerns. And then some practical shortcomings shown by these 20 years. So some signs of possible under-enforcement and merger control not fulfilling its purpose. And this perhaps exacerbated by the digital era. And the first reaction and the changes that we've seen try to control or scrutinize a greater number of mergers that were previously falling or going under the radar, mainly the killer acquisitions that might not meet the EU thresholds for assessment. So the different routes that have been on the table, have been under discussion, have been, as you know, the triggering or greater reliance on Article 22 of the European Union Merger Regulation, which is this possibility that the Commission can look at mergers under the thresholds, provided that there is a referral from the Member States. And this has again shown that it's proven difficult, as you know, from the Illumina Grail saga, where the court found that the Commission had made excessive use of its powers under Article 22. And it was not, in fact, it should not have scrutinized that merger. There is also a provision in the Digital Markets Act, but obviously this is specific for mergers affecting platforms. So its scope is limited, and it's just a possibility of at least looking at these mergers. It's not clear what the Commission can do about these mergers anyway. Then there is also the Towercast route, which would be before the national court, before the national competition authorities, if a merger, if there is an abuse of dominant position, the possibility of scrutinizing under those circumstances. But again, it's something that is being developed now at the national level, and the ongoing developments are not very promising. And the main area where we are seeing attempts to invigorate or carry out more sophisticated merger analysis would be in the building of new theories of harm. And this is linked to that idea of theories of harm. One of our proposals was rethinking the merger remedies. So I wanted to explain to you the logic of that idea. So the idea was, well, given that merger scrutiny is fact-intensive, so one would normally expect remedial tailoring to be necessary to address a merger's problems. But the remedies that the Commission usually accepts are quite standard. In the majority of complex cases that require phase 2 in-depth investigations, structural fixes, like mainly divestiture, are usually enforced, and they amount to close to 80% of the accepted commitments over time. And this preference can be understood in the context of the early years of merger control. So the first merger remedies notice was adopted back in 2001. And it talked about cases, the remedies being decided on a case-by-case basis, and that they should depend on the type, scale, scope of the acceptance of a remedy should depend on the type, scale, and scope of the remedies proposed. But at the same time, the Commission already said that structural remedies would be preferable. Now, this rationale also is in line with the courts. In the Gencor case, there is the courts dealt with the issue. At the time, the standard that applied was for the merger. For if a merger was to be blocked, it had to lead to the creation or strengthening of a dominant position. So in Gencor, the General Court insisted that when a merger might potentially create or strengthen dominance, the Commission would probably need to prevent that dominance. A commitment not to behave abusively, for instance, would not be sufficient, really, to make a dominance-enhancing concentration compatible with the internal market. And it's for this reason that the General Court established that structural remedies are, as a rule, preferable in as much as they prevent the emergence or the strengthening of a dominant position. And another advantage of structural remedies is obviously that they do not require monitoring. But the court, of course, recognized that the undesirable increase in market power could potentially be addressed or prevented in other ways. So, for example, a commitment not to use a trademark for a certain period, or a commitment to grant access to essential facilities on non-discriminatory terms. These were also different possibilities that were mentioned. Now, the mergers remedies notice was revised in 2008, and it maintains most of the basic principles of the previous system. So, first, remedies must always eliminate all the concerns identified. Second, structural remedies are preferred. Third, other remedies cannot be ruled out if they are capable of addressing when a merger significantly impedes effective competition. And fourth, the remedies need to be determined on a case-by-case basis. Now, if you read this notice, it provides some valuable explanations as to why behavioral remedies might not be suited to address some of the most significant concerns. So the commitments offered by the parties must meet 3 criteria to be acceptable. They must eliminate the concerns entirely, be comprehensive and effective from all points of view, and be capable of being implemented effectively within a short period of time. Well, obviously, from this perspective, if a merger is going to significantly impede effective competition, a commitment, for example, not to raise prices or not to reduce the range of products, will not be enough to address these horizontal overlaps. So such fixes are exceptional, would need to be monitored, and for non-structural commitments to be accepted as an alternative to divestiture, their effects would need to be at least equivalent to the structural remedies. Now, what is the issue? Why do we consider at least looking beyond structural remedies? Well, there have been a significant number of ex-post remedies studies, and what they suggest is that structural remedies have not been as effective as one would hope. So we don't have so many recent studies in the context of the EU, but in 2005, 20 years ago, the Commission published a study looking at 40 mergers where almost 100 fixes had been imposed. And it found, well, first, from a statistical perspective, in 77 of the remedies imposed on horizontal mergers, of 77, only 6 were non-structural. And in mergers with vertical and horizontal issues, of 13 remedies imposed, only 2 were behavioral. But there were close to 200 problems listed in relation to divestiture remedies. And then also the Commission looked at whether or not these were resolved in the end, and about 30% of these issues had remained unresolved. So among the things that can go wrong, for example, is that maybe sometimes the wrong assets are sold, or the business is sold to the wrong purchaser, or the business can deteriorate during the divestiture or after the divestiture. So this is why we're talking about the possibility of considering other remedies. And even former Commissioner Vestager, who has usually said, well, clean slate remedies should be preferred, she also said during the last years of her tenure that she was willing to consider behavioral solutions for mergers, especially in the digital economy. But in practice, we haven't really seen any major changes. And in recent years, I would say about 60% of the cases I've looked at were when the decisions were subject to conditions where these were structural remedies. So what would more behavioral remedies look like? Well, we would need to look at the possibilities and to see whether they could prevent, obviously, the harms of the merger. And I think that with the emergence of new theories of harm, we need to look outside the divestiture box and see how we can respond to these complex new theories. And other remedies offer versatility because they can be adapted over time, could even be reversed if necessary. And while this may be a relatively new proposition in some jurisdictions, in others this is something that has been done quite frequently, and this brings me to China. So I've been now based in Hong Kong for 15 years. Hong Kong doesn't have a merger control. We do have a competition law with a merger rule. The merger rule is limited to telecoms licensees. So we haven't really had any cases where this has been applied. So most of my focus on this area has been in China. And the Chinese competition authorities have frequently requested non-structural remedies for merger clearance. A good example of this is in the Korean Air ASEAN merger that was cleared in multiple jurisdictions. So in China, the competition authority saw a horizontal overlap in the scheduled air passenger services markets, and it solved it with behavioral commitments, requiring the maintenance of a stable supply of flights and fair renewal of air passenger transport agreement. In the EU, there was a divestiture requirement in some of the cargo business of ASEAN. And if we look at also the first decade of enforcement of the Chinese competition law, actually we see very original remedies. We see, for example, that whole separate remedies were quite common. So it just meant that the parties were allowed to merge, even though there were some concerns, as long as they did not integrate their businesses in China. And the logic behind this was, well, blocking too many decisions could lead to over-deterrence, and it could discourage foreign investment. Now, the original approach in China is worth taking into account, but there are important differences that cannot be overlooked. And with this, I'm going to end. So first, the Chinese system is outcomes oriented more than process oriented, and sometimes there have been concerns that the remedies imposed have not solved the competition concerns. So, for example, in the Max Linear Silicon Motion clearance decision, the issues related to customer concerns regarding supply security, and the remedy was not to add malicious codes in the design of products sold in China. In a non-merger case, in the Meituan food delivery app case, there was a fine for abuse of dominance. One of the remedies was to improve the driver's working conditions. Now, this would not go down well in Europe, where in air tours itself, the EU courts have told us that non-competition concerns would not be should not be considered. So the versatility of the remedies in China would hardly stand the judicial test in Europe. Now, second issue is that the remedies in China, some of them have, the usefulness has been called into question. Some years ago, the MOFCOM cleared a merger that affected the components used to make flat panels, displays, and liquid crystals. And the remedy was a commitment from the company to license its crystal patents on FRAND terms, but this company didn't hold any such patents, so it was actually didn't mean much in practice. So anyway, just as conclusion, in the European context also, behavioral commitments with greater imposing behavioral commitments with greater frequency could have some advantages, but at the same time, they also come with worrying costs. Ensuring proportionality is challenging. Authorities cannot always fully grasp the peculiarities of each industry they have to assess. And there was a study by Professor Fletcher in 2016 referring to the need for a comprehensive remedies package and effective design needing to consider multiple possibilities. And perhaps, so the next question, the final question would be whether behavioral remedies could be an alternative to blocking a merger or a complement to have greater leeway to address the concerns of mergers that are also subject to divestiture remedies. So with this, I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Any questions?
Hi, sorry. Can you hear me?
I don't think the mic is... Maybe you just need to speak a bit louder.
Seems to be on. Yeah. Hi, sorry. I have some experience as a monitoring trustee, so with both behavioural and divestiture commitments, so it's quite interesting. Thank you. I was just wondering whether you're aware of any studies that exist or have considered a study that sort of assesses how effective these remedies have been in some cases, because I know you mentioned there about problems that came up from divestiture. But part of me wonders as well about sort of just competitive outcomes of both, whether there's a sense, because obviously, as like you said, you saw more behavioural elsewhere, but actually I also wonder about whether they've been effective at addressing competition problems as well. And I think it would be useful perhaps to compare both and see whether there's been success there.
And before you answer that, if I could just tag onto that question and add that from a legal practitioner point of view, if you get behavioural remedies and not divestiture, it's open the champagne time. That's a great outcome for the client, which tells you a little bit about the outcome they'd like as the party subject to the regulation.
Yes, so in fact, that's precisely so we wanted to raise the issues because we frequently get asked the question from in my part of the world, why does the EU engage so much in structural remedies? We wanted to highlight, that's precisely one of the aims that we had in the paper, was to highlight some of the limitations of behavioral remedies, how difficult they are to monitor. Possibly as part of a more complete package, they can be considered. But if the problem that we always have with merger control, and this is something that I think is very difficult to resolve, is there is a lot of prediction going on. So normally, if you look at even the EU itself, the European Commission, in most Article 101, 102 cases, sometimes when a company is punished, there are also some behavioral commitments attached. And it's in merger control that we see more structural remedies imposed. One of the issues with merger control is its predictive nature, that we need to guess what is going to happen, and it's something that hasn't happened yet. We're assessing something that is going to happen down the line. As you know, counterfactual analysis is extremely difficult, especially in markets that are dynamic now, like in the digital economy. Indeed, the studies also reflect the limitations of behavioral remedies. And like you say, we saw in the Siemens-Alstom case, there was a real possibility, some of the member states put on the table the possibility of doing anything not to block the merger, including adopting structural remedies, non-structural remedies and other commitments. But there were very big concerns about that merger. Now, in the context, of course, we now have these calls for considering greater competitiveness. That could be perhaps something that we might see down the line. It's unclear what the new commission, where the new commission stands. I mean, reading between the lines, there is certainly room for some further considerations that had not been present before.
Yeah, sorry to be clear, I wasn't disparaging the effectiveness of behavioural remedies. I was more just thinking in that I'm aware that divestiture is somewhat uncertain, but also behavioural remedies are somewhat uncertain, and whether there was a view of which one might work better in the long run. But
I agree with you, yes.
Do you think they work as a trustee who oversees their implementation?
I could think of good and bad examples.
Any other questions? Well, I just have one comment or suggestion, which is that actually some of what you're talking about we're already seeing in the context of abuse of dominance enforcement, where there's a preference increasingly for commitment decisions. And I don't think many people realise that commitment decisions are far more about behavioural remedies than an infringement decision. Quite often in an infringement decision, the commission will say what is against the law, and then the company is kind of left to deal with compliance, whereas commitments is very much focused on specific changes to behaviour that address the competition concerns adequately enough for the competition authority to not investigate any further. So I just wonder if there's a broader story here, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that, that is also another thing that we actually put forward in the paper, the fact that there is a lot of insistence, and you will have seen this in recent cases, of consistency across EU competition policy and ensuring that what is done in the field of 101 and 102 is consistent with merger clause. So in that sense, yes, there is maybe some room for discussing maybe a more coherent merger approach, a remedies approach. But yeah, it's definitely challenging. And as I say, I do think that although, other jurisdictions, the experience of other jurisdictions is interesting and definitely can be looked at, but the circumstances are definitely very different, yeah.
Thank you very much. And magically, we're back on schedule. So thank you. Please join me in saying thank you to our panellists for this session. We've now got a coffee break.